Many thanks to the organizer for making these days possible each year. I'm delighted to share some results of my research on the philosophy of medicine. And I would also obviously like to thank FILSLAN for allowing me to finish this thesis in very good conditions. So the aim of this short presentation is to give an overview of my thesis work, bearing in mind that I was trained as a philosopher, and it's a work of philosophy of medicine. So my encounter with ALS came in the field thanks to my co-supervisor Daniel Seillan and thanks to Séverine Boile's team at the Brain Institute. Taking an interest in ALS means dealing with many different perspectives from various people, patients, families, caregivers, scientists, associations, and policymakers. This variety of viewpoints is common in medicine. However, this mix can lead to dissonances, which are conflicts in understanding, and this can have practical consequences. These dissonances arise because of epistemic plurality, meaning there are multiple accepted representations of the same phenomenon at the same time. Different groups, each with their own information and interest, contribute to this. These groups form what I call epistemic communities. In the context of ALS, this leads to a range of viewpoints that sometimes clash. So my work examines these clashes or epistemic challenges and their potential impacts. Addressing the epistemic challenges of ALS in philosophy has two aims in my work. First, a practical one, to provide a reading grid for these challenges and a global vision of ALS at the service of those directly concerned in care and research. And second, a theoretical one, to show how the case of ALS can feed into various classical debates in the philosophy of medicine. So quickly, what about my methods? Philosophical methods are a vast philosophical subject. And unlike other human and social sciences, philosophy does not produce new empirical data. Instead, it examines the coherence, relevance, and rigor of the use of concept and representation. But doing applied philosophy, or also field philosophy, most of my research material comes from outside the field of philosophy. Press articles, illness narratives, medical and biomedical literature, historical literature, documentary and fiction films, and various kinds of documentation. I base my argument and my thinking on this material, and I articulate descriptive section with more argumentative and normative section. So finally, my work is divided into three parts that address different epistemic challenges. Today, I will briefly review these three parts. So, for the first part, neurologists Pierre-François Prindin and Jean-Marc Léger note the existence of a number of preconceived ideas about the state of knowledge and medical practices regarding to ALS. According to them, these preconceived ideas are expressed in terms of supposed total ignorance of the origin of the disease or absolute therapeutic helplessness. This quote resonates with a sense of discrepancy between what I read about ALS and the discussion I've had at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital and at the Brain Institute, a discrepancy that lies at the heart of the first part of my work. In the first chapter, I identify and characterize a conception of the state of medical knowledge and practice related to ALS. In the various discourses that I characterize, illness narratives, scientific mediation, press articles, ethical literature, I show that certain formulations suggest two things in line with the statement of Prindin and Léger. ALS will be a disease that medicine is helplessness to treat, and this helplessness will be the consequence of a total ignorance of its causes and mechanism. The helplessness and ignorance will be such that ALS will become an exemplary disease of medicine difficulties in understanding and treating the disease. In the second chapter, I show that this conception is problematic. It is flawed in the sense that it is not consistent with what can be observed about the state of knowledge and medical practices related to ALS. And it is also based on questionable assumptions about the nature of medical knowledge and care practices. It may also have harmful practical consequences. So in the third chapter, I show it is desirable to challenge this conception. The singular symptomatology of ALS feeds the idea that medicine is particularly ignorant on helplessness in the face of this disorder. And there is a shift from the singularity of ALS symptomatology to an alleged singularity of the state of medical knowledge and practice regarding ALS. So in this first part, I use the traditional distinction in the philosophy of medicine between disorder as a disease, an object of medical study, disorder as an illness, an experience lived by sufferers, and disorder as a sickness, a so as a phenomenon recognized by society, to analyze these shifts and to understand the porosity of the various discourses on ALS. Based on this analysis, I use the notion of epistemic humility to promote dialogue between these different perspectives on ALS and to avoid this shift. So quickly, in the second part, I am looking at the genesis of the ALS concept in medical discourse. Most often, this genesis is, as the American neurologist Lewis Pirboland points out, associated with the work of Jean-Martin Charcot. However, his assertion here begs the question, to what extent has the concept of ALS not been modified since it was developed by Charcot in 1873? The aim of this section is not to constitute a new historical survey, but to analyze the issues involved in the production and dissemination of historical discourses about ALS, particularly within the biomedical community, and their consequences for the conceptualization of ALS. So firstly, I identify historical traces, in other words, allusive reference to history in current medical practices and discourses on ALS. The main example is Charcot's disease and the use of eponym. Secondly, I show that these references are closely linked to a narrative, that of the discovery of ALS by Jean-Martin Charcot, in which a hagiographic register predominates. I analyze the various functions and relevance of such a narrative to the current discourses and practices of the ALS community. And the primary advantage of this narrative is that it provides a common basis for representation of the ALS concept among a wide range of actors. And I then identify the damaging consequences of such a hagiographic narrative. I show that this narrative is a factor of ignorance for the history of medicine and for the current conceptualization of ALS within the ALS community. In this part, I use the theoretical notion of positivism and of boundary object to explain the role of history in ALS discourses. So finally, in the third and last part, I talk about classification of ALS. Classification is a very common problem in philosophy of medicine. So ALS is often presented as a neuroevolutionary disease, a motor neuron disease, and a rare disease. And despite their potential relevance, these categories have limitations that are highlighted in the biomedical literature, limitations that I study in this part. Initially, I focus on the following question: is ALS a disease or a syndrome? And by considering ALS as a boundary object, it is possible to grasp the extent to which it is not a question of deciding between ALS disease and ALS syndrome, but of showing how each categorization serves different objectives and can thus coexist. Secondly, I integrate the category motor disease, faced with the epistemological, nosological, ethical, and practical issues of psychological and cognitive impairment in ALS. And the last chapter focuses on another kind of category, not medical, but primarily political and economic, to describe ALS. ALS is a rare disease, but the ALS community frequently uses the phrase the least rare of rare diseases, and I show the extent to which this formula allows us to question the relevance and limits of the rare disease category to designate ALS. So in this first part, I use a pragmatic framework to integrate the categorization of ALS, and the notion of the boundary object is again used to identify the plasticity of the ALS concept. So in all my work, I've studied various formulas describing ALS as the worst of diseases, a disease paradigmatic of the difficulties of medicine, Charcot's most brilliant discovery, a pure motor disorder, a heterogeneous entity, or the least rare of rare diseases. Most of these phrases give ALS a unique status among diseases, but they are rarely developed. However, as the philosopher Marigai points out, one of the roles traditionally assigned to philosophy is to ensure that the complexity of phenomena and issues is not underestimated. So in summary, I hope to have brought classical philosophical literature into dialogue with concrete problems, most of which have already been identified by the ALS community, but whose analysis I am deepening in order to develop tools and avenues of research for the future. So I know that humanities and social sciences and ALS are in the minority at these research days, and I didn't have time today to present the specificities of these sciences in relation to medical and biomedical knowledge. My PhD is part of the Biomedical Humanities initiative of the Sorbonne University, which promotes collaboration between the social sciences and humanities and the medical and biological sciences. Philosophy of medicine is one of several disciplines in this field. So I really think ALS research will benefit from more collaboration with the humanities and social sciences, bearing in mind that my work is just a small example. Here are some other recent work in social science and humanities about ALS. The work of Anthony Stavrianakis is in anthropology. The work of Nadine Le Forestier is in ethics. And the work of Jérémy Geoffroy is in sociology of food. And I recommend you look at today on the poster of Jérémy Geoffroy. It's the number 14, if I remember well. So many thanks to FILSLAN for this 4th year of funding and for allowing me to make this presentation today. And thanks to all the people and structures that have made this research work possible. And thanks to all of you for your listening. Thanks.
Là, on attend les questions. Je suis sûr que Luc en a une.
Right here. So, with this sort of epistemological challenge, what do you think that means for trying to actually find a treatment? I'm not saying a cure. I mean, is it wasted time because of that? Or in spite of the challenges, we should do it and just keep your analysis in the back of our mind?
No, I think it's important to search a treatment, obviously. I think in my conclusion, I say that if we found a treatment, my analysis will change, obviously. Like for the VIH, there is a lot of representation modified with the treatment. So I think, like all research, I will have to adapt with the modification of representation.
So I have a question actually. Okay. So if I understood correctly, you show that there's a bias in our presentation of the disease that is due to historical and a number of training issues, I guess, or working on historical documents, etc. So how would you help us to prevent this? How would it be possible, for instance, to avoid some of the biases that you identified, the least rare of the rare diseases, and this kind of sentences that we all say in our talks?
Yes, it's a very good question, because even me, when I have to talk about ALS in front of people who don't know the disease, I do this. I use this kind of phrases to go quickly and to say, okay, ALS is, and make a quick presentation. But it's a very, very good question. But because in my thesis, I do not create precise recommendation, but I just clarified the different objectives of discourses. So I recognize that to say the least rare of rare disease, it's a very precise phrase, and this phrase have a very precise objective to put the intention around the disease. And so my thesis is one first step, but it's not about recommendation. It's just to say, if you say this phrase, the consequence and the objectives of the phrase is, and I explained all the points, but it's a very good question. Because in my, I developed very quickly the question about the competition between all the diseases, for example, and the fact that to communicate about a disease, you have to call intention, and it's very difficult, especially in public health and this kind of topic. But it's a very good question.
Just a quick comment, because I'm a drug discoverer I've put 12 drugs into clinical trials in different areas, and I'm now working on ALS. But I'm also I follow a Popperian philosophy, who said that you think that all swans are white until eventually you see a black one. And effectively, that means that although we've got our preconcepts, you can possibly screen on proper systems and try and find a black swan. And there's a guy called Taleb who's shown you how to do that. And I've actually used a way for looking specifically at what you want and screening for it to find a black swan. And sometimes they exist because you've got so many variables in your experimentation that you actually don't go for what you want as the output. So it means screening on outputs. And that can actually philosophically link with what you're saying. Look for black swans, which will solve the disease.
He's the black swan. Bon. T'as trouvé le signe noir?
It might be it's more an advice for FILSLAN actually, or for it might be interesting that you have a look at the e-learning modules that have been done or prepared by many of us with your philosopher view, because that might be maybe the unconscious biases that we have might have biased our ways to present these modules. So maybe that's something that could be interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree, because it's the difficult part of my work, because it's applied philosophy, but in the later faculty, the main goal is the theoretical goal. So like making papers about the concept of disease in general, and applied is not very valorized, but it's why I can't in my thesis go further about application. So yes, it will be very interesting for me.